In the summer of 1989, a young mother was found dead in the Arizona desert, her two toddler daughters nowhere in sight. For 36 years, those little girls existed only as names on a missing persons report. Jasmine and Elizabeth Ramos, ages 2 and 3, last seen alive somewhere in Mojave County. Then, in September 2025, a woman in her late 30s submitted a consumer DNA sample to a genealogy database. Not looking for a killer, not even looking for justice, just looking for herself. What the lab returned would collapse 3.5 decades of silence in a single afternoon, and what it revealed about where those children have been all along is something no investigator had ever considered. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. This one's going to stay with you. The year 1989 carried a particular kind of restless energy. The Berlin Wall was still standing in June of that year, though not for much longer. In American households, Bobby Brown's Every Little Step played on kitchen radios, and people were just beginning to hear about something called the World Wide Web. It was a world without cell phone towers blanketing the desert, without surveillance cameras at every gas station, without the digital footprint that now follows every human being from the moment they leave their front door. Maria Ramos was 24 years old that summer. She had grown up in Ventura County, California, the kind of woman who kept a small notebook of her daughter's first words. Her neighbors in the Oxnard apartment complex where she lived remembered her as someone who always locked her door twice. Once to make sure, once to be certain. She had dark hair she wore in a single braid, and she had recently started taking community college courses 2 evenings a week. She was not someone who vanished. She was someone who showed up. On the morning of June 14th, 1989, Maria packed a bag for what neighbors later told investigators appeared to be a road trip. Her daughters Jasmine, 3 years old, and Elizabeth, 2, were dressed in matching yellow shirts. A woman in the adjacent unit saw Maria loading a car, not her own vehicle, which remained in the parking lot for the next 11 days, just after 8 in the morning. The car was a light-colored sedan, possibly a Buick or an Oldsmobile. The neighbor could not identify the driver. Maria was smiling. She waved. 11 days passed before anyone reported Maria missing. Her mother in Oxnard had called twice and received no answer, but Maria had gone quiet before, usually when she was stressed about money or a relationship. Her mother waited. Then she drove to the apartment. The door was locked. Maria's car was there. Her houseplants, which Maria watered every other morning without fail, were brown and dead at the roots. Mojave County Sheriff's deputies received an anonymous call on June 27, 1989. A man's voice, calm and brief, reported that there was a body off a service road approximately 18 miles northeast of Kingman, Arizona. He gave a rough location and hung up. Deputies found Maria Ramos that same afternoon. She was partially concealed beneath a shallow layer of sand and broken scrub brush. She had been dead for approximately 10 to 14 days, placing her death within the window of June 14th or 15th. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled. She was 24 years old, and she was alone. Jasmine and Elizabeth were not there. They were not anywhere nearby. Search teams covered the surrounding desert for 3 days. There were no small footprints, no discarded clothing, no evidence at all that the children had been in that location. They had simply ceased to exist in the official record. Present in Oxnard on the morning of June 14th, absent from the earth by June 27th, and completely untraceable in between. Mojave County detectives worked the case through the remainder of 1989 and into 1990. They identified a man Maria had been seeing intermittently in the months before her death. A truck driver from the Inland Empire, whose name has not been publicly released pending ongoing proceedings. He was interviewed twice, produced an alibi for June 14th that investigators found thin but could not disprove, and was never charged. The anonymous caller was never identified. The light-colored sedan was never found. What investigators did not do, and this is where the system failed Maria Ramos and her daughters in a way that is difficult to overstate, was entered Jasmine and Elizabeth into the National Crime Information Center Missing Persons Database as endangered children. In 1989, the protocols for entering children connected to homicide victims were inconsistent across jurisdictions. Mojave County logged the girls as missing, but the classification that would have triggered federal involvement and national alerts was never applied. The caseworker assigned to follow up on the children's status transferred to a different department 4 months later. No one picked up her files. The Ramos sisters fell through the exact gap in the system they were designed to catch. Maria's mother, Consuelo Ramos, hired an attorney in 1991 to push law enforcement to reclassify the case. The attorney sent letters to the Mojave County Sheriff's Office, to the California Department of Justice, and to what was then the newly established National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She received 3 acknowledgments and no action. In 1994, Consuelo placed a classified advertisement in 3 California newspapers, describing her missing granddaughters by name and the circumstances of their mother's murder. One person responded. It was a man who had seen a similar ad in a different paper and wanted to know if she had found the children. She had not. There was a detective named Roy Castillo who joined the Mojave County Sheriff's Office in 1997, 8 years after Maria's body was found. Cold cases were not his assignment, but the Ramos file was kept in a cabinet near his desk because the previous occupant of that desk had worked it briefly in 1994. Castillo read the file on a slow Tuesday and could not put it down. He began working on his own time, evenings and weekends, calling it his Tuesday case because that was the day he had first opened the folder. He located 3 additional witnesses from the Oxnard apartment complex who had never been formally interviewed. He tracked down the truck driver whose alibi had been considered thin and conducted a voluntary re-interview in 2003. He found inconsistencies, but inconsistencies are not evidence, and the physical evidence from the scene, limited to trace fibers and a partial boot print, had been stored under conditions that degraded its usefulness over time. Castillo retired in 2019. Before he left, he ensured the Ramos case was formally redesignated as active cold case and submitted for review under Arizona's cold case unit, which had been established in 2016 with a specific mandate to apply modern forensic tools to unsolved homicides. He left a printed photograph of Maria Ramos on the desk of his successor. On the back, in his handwriting, her daughters are still out there. The Arizona Cold Case Unit began working the Ramos file in early 2020. Their first step was not DNA. It was paperwork. Investigators spent 8 months simply rebuilding a complete picture of what physical evidence still existed and what had been lost. The trace fibers were largely unusable. The boot print photograph had survived. A small amount of biological material collected from beneath Maria's fingernails in 1989 had been preserved, barely, imperfectly, but preserved. Here is where the science becomes the story. Genetic genealogy is not the same as the DNA test that tells you whether someone was at a crime scene. Traditional forensic DNA builds a profile from a sample and compares it to a database of known offenders. If the killer isn't in that database, you get nothing. For decades, that was the wall every investigator in the Ramos case ran into. Genetic genealogy works differently. Think of it like this. Instead of looking for an exact match, investigators take the DNA from the crime scene and upload it to a public genealogy database. The same kind people use when they spit into a tube and discover they have distant cousins in County Cork. The DNA doesn't need to match the killer directly. It just needs to match someone related to the killer, a second cousin, a great-niece, anyone who shares enough genetic material to create a family tree. Then investigators build that tree outward, and when it intersects with other evidence, location, age, access to the victim, a suspect emerges. That is what the Arizona Cold Case Unit did with the biological material from Maria Ramos's fingernails in 2022. A private forensic genealogy firm processed the degraded sample and extracted a usable profile. It was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public database that allows law enforcement uploads for violent crimes. Within 3 months, the profile matched 2 distant relatives, people who had submitted their own DNA for ancestry research, with no connection to any crime. From those 2 relatives, analysts built a family tree that eventually identified a single individual whose age, location in 1989, and connection to the greater Los Angeles and Inland Empire area placed him in close proximity to Maria Ramos in the months before her death. That man was in his 60s, living in Nevada. He had no criminal record. He had built a quiet life for 36 years. Investigators did not move immediately. They conducted 4 months of surveillance. They retrieved discarded DNA, a coffee cup, the kind of ordinary object a person throws away without a second thought, and confirmed a direct match to the material collected from beneath Maria's fingernails in 1989. An arrest warrant was issued in August 2025. His name, released upon arraignment, was Dennis Carl Voorhees. But the investigation had also opened a second thread. And this one was not about the killer. When analysts were building the family tree from the crime scene DNA, they were simultaneously doing something else. They were looking for the children. Jasmine and Elizabeth Ramos had never been found. They had no known DNA profile in any system. But in 2023, a woman named Andrea Kellerman, 37 years old, living in Sacramento, California, had submitted a consumer DNA test to Ancestry.com out of simple curiosity. She had been adopted as an infant, she believed, and knew almost nothing about her biological origins. The test returned no close matches, no parents, no siblings. She noted it, filed it away, and moved on. Then, in early 2025, a genetic genealogist working a separate case noticed something in the public database. Andrea Kellerman's DNA profile shared enough markers with a second female profile, a woman named Diane Hoskins, 36, also adopted, living in Portland, Oregon, to indicate that the 2 women were almost certainly biological sisters. Neither woman knew the other existed. The genealogist flagged both profiles and began building their shared family tree. The tree led, within 6 weeks, to Consuelo Ramos. Contact was made carefully through an intermediary. Consuelo was 81 years old. She had been told, gently, that investigators believed they had located her granddaughters. She asked one question before anything else. She asked whether they were alive. They were. Jasmine Ramos, living since childhood as Andrea Kellerman, was 39 years old. Elizabeth Ramos, living as Diane Hoskins, was 38. Both women had been adopted through what investigators now believe were informal, undocumented private arrangements made in the fall of 1989. In October of that year, 3 months after Maria's murder, a woman had left 2 young girls in a public restroom at a shopping mall in Oxnard, California. A mall employee found them within minutes. The girls were clean, fed, wearing new clothing, and carrying no identification. They were calm. The older one told the employee her name was Jasmine. The younger one did not speak. California Child Protective Services took custody. No one connected them to the missing persons report in Arizona, which had never been entered into the federal system. The girls were placed separately with foster families and later adopted. Their names were changed as part of the adoption process, a standard practice in California at that time for children whose origins were unclear and whose birth families could not be located. They had been 80 miles from their grandmother for nearly 4 decades. When Andrea Kellerman, Jasmine, was told the complete story in September 2025, she asked investigators to repeat it twice. Then she said, quietly, that there had always been something she could not explain. A dream she had, recurring since childhood, of yellow shirts and a woman with a braid. Dennis Carl Voorhees was arraigned in Mojave County on September 11, 2025, on 1 count of first-degree murder in the death of Maria Ramos. Prosecutors have indicated they intend to pursue additional charges related to the abandonment of the children. He has pleaded not guilty. As of the time this script was written, trial is scheduled for 2026. Consuelo Ramos, 81 years old, attended the arraignment. She sat in the front row. She was accompanied by her two granddaughters, Jasmine and Elizabeth, Andrea and Diane to the families who raised them, and both names now to themselves, had met for the first time 10 days earlier in a conference room at the Arizona Cold Case Unit's office in Phoenix. Investigators had offered to be present or to give them privacy. They asked for privacy. They were in that room for 2 hours. No one outside that room knows what was said, and no one is asked. At the arraignment, Consuelo gave a brief statement to reporters outside the courthouse. She said that she had placed a photograph of Maria on her kitchen table every morning for 36 years. She said she had talked to it every day. She said she had told Maria that she would not stop. She said she never did. The judge presiding at the arraignment, reviewing the case record before setting a trial date, noted from the bench that the 1989 failure to enter Jasmine and Elizabeth Ramos into the federal missing children's database represented a systemic breakdown that had consequences for an entire family across a span of decades. He did not editorialize. He simply named it. Sometimes that is enough. 3 things this case teaches that are worth writing down. First, if you're a family member of an unsolved homicide victim and that victim had children who disappeared alongside her, verify independently that those children were entered into the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database as endangered missing, not simply as missing persons. These are different classifications with different consequences. You can contact NCMEC directly at 1-800-843-5678 to confirm an entry exists and to request a review of the classification. This step costs nothing and can be done by any family member. Second, consumer genealogy databases have become one of the most powerful cold case tools in existence, but they only work when people submit DNA. If you have a missing or murdered family member, consider submitting your own DNA to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA and marking your profile as available for law enforcement comparison. You're not looking for the killer. You're placing a beacon in the dark that investigators can navigate toward. Third, informal and undocumented adoptions were not rare in the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. If you were adopted and your records are unclear or absent, and if you have submitted consumer DNA with no close matches, you may be in a situation similar to Andrea Kellerman's. The DNA Doe Project and similar organizations work specifically on unidentified individuals, including living adults with unknown origins. These are not cold case resources only. They are identity resources, and they are free. Jasmine and Elizabeth Ramos were separated by an act of violence in 1989. They were found by science in 2025. Their grandmother was still at the table. If you know something about this case, or any case that has stayed with you, leave it in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it. Somewhere, right now, there's a family that has been waiting 30 years for someone to see the right thing at the right time. Sometimes that someone is a viewer.